Forget strategy meetings and dusty maps. Let's rewind to the spring of 1940. When the terrifying thunder of German panzers ripped through the Ardennes, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was a national nightmare. Imagine being a French soldier, standing there, realizing the machines you were supposed to trust, the very tanks France pioneered in the Great War, were utterly useless. They were slow. They were scattered. They were utterly unprepared for the ruthless speed of the Blitzkrieg, and that memory didn't just fade away. By 1944, 4 years later, that shame was still a physical weight on every French survivor. They recalled, with absolute bitterness, how their supposedly vaunted Char B-1 heavy tanks, steel fortresses formidable in armor and firepower, had been completely squandered. They were left isolated without fuel, picked apart by dive bombers, and turned into slow-moving coffins, monuments to a doctrine that had failed them spectacularly. Try to get into the head of a resistance fighter in 44. When they heard the word tank, they didn't feel hope. They felt a visceral mix of awe and dread. They remembered the sheer, terrifying speed of the German machines, the roar of panzers outpacing their units, the whole country collapsing in 6 humiliating weeks. To them, armor wasn't liberation, it was the symbol of their humiliating failure, and they genuinely believed nothing could ever move faster than the German machines that had broken their country. For 4 long years under occupation, this impression hardened. Hiding in dusty barns and secret cellars, resistance fighters often argued about what the Allies would even bring. Maybe the slow, grinding British Churchill or Matilda tanks. Big, heavy steel beasts, designed only to slug it out. They had vague whispers about American armor, but it was just an abstract dream, a symbol of a powerful friend they hoped would appear. What they didn't know was that while they were arguing over slow, heavy steel, America had ripped up the rulebook. The U.S. Army looked at the disaster of 1940 and learned one giant lesson: speed kills. They didn't build a static fortress, they built a philosophy: movement, coordination, reliability, and sheer, overwhelming numbers. Enter the Sherman tank. It wasn't the biggest puncher, but French soldiers training overseas in North Africa and Britain started sending back unbelievable stories. Tales of Shermans marching hundreds of kilometers without breaking down, that they could be repaired in hours, not days, and that columns of them rolled across the land like a steel river that never dried up. But honestly, if you lived through the Char B-1 disaster, wouldn't you be skeptical? It sounded too good to be true. So when Operation Overlord finally hit Normandy in the summer of 1944, the French fighters were ready for artillery, bombers, and infantry. They expected slow, vulnerable tanks that needed constant care. What was coming, however, the sheer, relentless rumble of those American columns arriving inland, was about to shatter every single assumption they had about armored warfare. They were about to witness a doctrine of speed they couldn't have imagined, and it would finally begin to erase the scar of 1940. Okay, stop and think about that for a second. The idea that their liberators, the Americans, would bring tanks that were faster, stronger, enduring. It honestly sounded like a sick joke to these guys. They had seen their own beautiful tanks break down mid-battle, leaving their buddies exposed in 1940. They were carrying the ghosts of that entire disaster, haunted by the memory of sudden collapse, humiliation, and hunger. When they finally came face to face with American steel in 1944, they wouldn't just see machines, they would see the embodiment of a new doctrine, a desperate promise that history might not repeat itself. But man, you have to understand how deep that skepticism ran to truly grasp the shock that was coming. By 1941, France was ripped in half, the north was under the iron heel of Berlin, and the south was run by the collaborating Vichy regime. If you were a soldier who made it home, life became defined by silence and waiting. The glorious parades on the Champs-Élysées. Gone, replaced by stiff, marching German patrols. When these men, who used to wear proud uniforms, met in secret, whispered in dimly lit barns, their weapons were often just old hunting rifles and pistols, passed hand to hand. Can you imagine the sheer absurdity of planning to take on a German panzer division with a rusty shotgun? For them, tanks weren't symbols of liberation anymore, they were the terrifying, untouchable proof of the occupiers' overwhelming power. Any French armor they had managed to hide, those massive Char B-1s, were just relics, rusting away because they had no fuel, or because one German patrol would find them and it would be game over. They saw their once invincible tanks now repainted with the Iron Cross, used as German trophies. The lesson of 1940 was brutal and simple: mobility and speed killed them. The enemy had fast, decisive weapons. France had none. The resistance got bolder by 1943, hitting rail lines and convoys. But even as they risked their lives, the German armored columns felt like ghosts you couldn't touch. Every time an American plane dropped a leaflet promising freedom, they clutched it like a holy relic. But the question always lingered: would the Allies bring machines that could actually match the panzers that had humiliated France? Or was this just another beautiful lie? Meanwhile, far away in the dust and heat of North Africa, the Free French who joined the Allies were getting the first real glimpse. After Operation Torch in 1942, they trained with U.S. forces. And that's where they met the Sherman tank. Its broad tracks and rounded turret seemed unassuming at first glance. At first glance, the Sherman looked, well, unimpressive. Especially compared to the mythical German Tigers these Free French soldiers had heard about. It didn't have that hulking, brutish silhouette. But then they watched them move. This wasn't about size, it was about sheer, unholy endurance. These American tanks didn't choke on dust or overheat and stall out after a few miles, like the relics France had relied on. They just rolled forward, tirelessly, like mechanical predators built for non-stop motion. That sight, the sustained speed, flipped a switch inside those skeptical French officers. They started whispering to each other, realizing, maybe these Americans actually cracked the code. Maybe they learned how to fight the Germans on their own terms. But here's the hook: the vast majority of French fighters back home had no idea about this revelation. They were still hiding in basements and barn cellars, living half-lives, farmers by day, partisans by night, always listening for the terrifying sound of German boots on the cobblestones. For them, tanks weren't a promise, they were pure, agonizing nightmares. They knew, deep down, that only overwhelming Allied armor could save them, but who could blame them for their skepticism? They had been promised salvation in 1940, and it turned into the worst humiliation imaginable. They measured time not in months, but in rumors: the rumor of an Allied fleet, the rumor of impossible American wealth, the rumor of tanks that could actually outrun the panzer divisions. They dreamed of those machines, but they couldn't truly believe in them. They had lived under the shadow of defeat for too long to trust that deliverance could arrive with such mechanical swiftness. Disbelief, ironically, was the only armor they had left. Then, June 1944 hit. The Channel crossing. The French countryside began to tremble, and the anticipation was electric. For years, the invasion was just smoke and whispers: American soldiers with strange accents, endless supplies, a tide that the Germans couldn't stop. Now, on the beaches of Normandy, it was suddenly real. French resistance fighters and civilians strained to see the power their allies were bringing ashore. When the first contacts happened, the contrasts were jarring, almost surreal. The GIs looked different. They were practical, their gear was endless, and they carried cigarettes, chocolate, and chewing gum, luxuries that were unimaginable under occupation. To the starving French, who had learned to survive on scraps, this American abundance was a shock almost as profound as the fighting itself. But it was the machines, the hulking shapes rumbling behind the infantry, that truly drew the astonished stares. The French remembered the slow, clanking relics, the Char B-1s, that had failed them instantly in 1940. The Germans had permanently scarred their minds with images of panzers moving like lightning. And yet, here they were, rolling through the muddy Norman hedgerows, American Sherman tanks, dozens of them, moving in formation with an effortless confidence that felt utterly alien. Let's be honest, at first glance, some of the French fighters were totally underwhelmed. They'd spent years hearing about the gigantic German Tigers, the true monsters of steel. These American Shermans. They looked kinda small. They didn't have that terrifying, brutish silhouette the propaganda promised. But then the columns kept coming. And coming. And that's when the rhythm hit them. This wasn't just a few isolated tanks lumbering forward, waiting to get ambushed. This was a system. A living, breathing, mechanized organism. The sound wasn't the slow, desperate clunk-clunk they remembered from 1940. It was a synchronized, powerful hum of engines, their tracks cutting across fields without hesitation. These tanks didn't crawl, they flowed. Imagine being a resistance fighter, crouching by a dusty Norman crossroad, watching these columns stream past. Could tanks really move this fast? Could they actually keep pace with every truck, every jeep, every foot soldier in one seamless advance? For guys whose entire military memory was defined by tank stalling, overheating, and then getting stuck, this sight was absolutely mind-bending. For the first time, armor felt less like a heavy burden and more like a force of sheer, unstoppable liberation. The Americans had cracked the code, logistics. The columns seemed endless, sure, but look closer. Right behind the Shermans were dozens of trucks hauling fuel and ammo. It was planned out perfectly. Mobile workshops, spare parts dumps, the whole 9 yards. The memory of 1940 was simple: a tank without fuel is just a heavy box, useless and abandoned. But here, in the summer of 1944, these machines seemed immune to failure. The American attitude was equally shocking. They treated these tanks not like sacred national treasures, but like tools. If one got knocked out, who cares? Another one took its place. The crews even joked darkly, calling the Shermans Ronsons or Tommy Cookers, because, yes, they caught fire easily, yet they still had this unwavering confidence in their speed and mobility. To the French, who had survived on scraps for years, this level of abundance was almost unbelievable. It was like the Americans had a secret, bottomless factory of steel and gasoline hidden right under the Atlantic. The psychological effect? Instant. Those deep, crippling doubts about France's future started to dissolve. The tide wasn't just turning because of the sheer number of guys on the beach, it was turning because of momentum. These American tanks didn't pause, they didn't stumble, they just kept going. And as Sherman after Sherman thundered past, the French fighters finally, truly started to believe that the nightmare of 1940 could be wiped away, not with empty promises, but with the relentless, physical roar of American tracks. Okay, so picture this: it wasn't just tanks rolling up. It was an entire damn factory on wheels. Jeeps, half-tracks, supply trucks, armored cars, a monstrous, churning steel river that just didn't stop. For the French guys who remembered the disaster of 1940, standing there watching this American machine flow past was like a punch to the gut. They finally saw exactly how far behind their own army had fallen. They'd been used to seeing maybe 1 or 2 French tanks stranded, smoking on a lonely roadside. Now, they saw dozens, stretching out further than they could even measure. It wasn't just the sheer number of Shermans, but the fact that every single one was backed up by a logistics pipeline that seemed to run straight back across the Atlantic. Now, let's be honest. At first glance, some of the French resistance guys weren't exactly blown away. These Shermans looked kinda small, right? They didn't have that terrifying, brutish silhouette of a German tiger that the propaganda posters had drilled into their heads. Their guns seemed modest. But then, they saw them fight. This is where the script flips. They realized these wasn't the slow, clunky French B-1 tanks they remembered, which practically needed a committee meeting just to turn a corner. The Shermans were fluid. They weren't lumbering giants, they were dancers. They could weave through those tight Norman lanes, zip over hills at speeds that made the French observers gasp, and pivot their huge turrets without losing a step. They didn't stop and form a neat line for some grand duel. They just kept pressing forward, relentless motion. Can you imagine the feeling? One resistance fighter later said the earth beneath his feet shook for hours. He was terrified because it brought back the nightmare sound of 1940, German tanks rolling in for the conquest. But this time the columns were friendly. It was terrifying and absolutely exhilarating. The pace was insane. They moved like cavalry, one French officer muttered, stunned. This wasn't the old, heavy armor doctrine where you stopped and tried to outgun the enemy one-on-one. The Americans had a different playbook. They weren't trying to duel tigers, they were trying to drown them. It was a strategy of swarm and momentum. The whole formation acted like a single, massive, angry organism. The 1940 French tanks might have been better on paper, heavier armor, bigger guns, but they were always scattered, always breaking down, always starved of fuel. The Americans showed the French what massed armor, supported armor, actually looked like. As the Shermans blitzed through liberated villages, the soldiers watching weren't just cheering, they were studying. They noted the incredible speed, the quick halt and pivot, the radio chatter, the seamless choreography between the tankers and the infantry marching alongside. This wasn't just hardware, this was coordination France had never achieved. For the French soldiers riding atop those tanks, or running beside them, the disbelief slowly curdled into pure, unadulterated hope. Every kilometer gained, every German roadblock crushed under those tracks, chipped away at the deep, deep shame of 1940. They finally understood the secret the Americans had mastered. It wasn't the weight of the steel that mattered. It was the speed and the sheer, unstoppable will to move. By the time those Shermans chewed up more French dirt, the skepticism was dead. The French soldiers who had initially doubted these smaller tanks were now talking openly about how good they were. Why? Because they saw it with their own eyes. American armor wasn't just functional, its rhythm, its tempo, was relentless. It felt like history had slammed into reverse. The very roads that once carried Hitler's conquering columns now thundered with Allied liberation machines, stronger and way faster than anything France had ever rolled out. And in that realization, that they were finally winning, French soldiers found not just hope, but a whole new reason to fight. The first thing that hit you was the visual, these endless metal snakes rolling over the horizon, stretching further than any French eye could measure. But the second thing, the one that truly got under your skin, was the sound. This wasn't the sputtering, erratic roar of the French machines from 1940, nor was it the chilling, mechanical clatter of the German panzers they remembered from the nightmares. The Shermans had a different beat. It was a steady, rhythmic, industrial growl. A heartbeat of steel pumping relentlessly through the Norman hedgerows. It was the sound of inevitability, a mechanical thunder that signaled not just movement, but unstoppable advance. Think about that, in 1940, when you heard tanks, you heard terror. You heard the shrill shriek of Stuka sirens above, engines dying, and the total, paralyzing chaos of collapse. That trauma was so deeply ingrained that even in 1944, when the first rumble started, resistance fighters would instinctively flinch. But as those American columns closed in, the sound revealed a completely different truth. This wasn't the noise of a predator hunting them down. This was the confident, precise sound of an ally, carrying liberation on its tracks. And in combat, that speed became terrifyingly clear. French fighters who rode along were stunned by how fast the Shermans could redeploy. A German ambush set up in a tight village. The Shermans didn't lumber straight into it like the old French armor would have. No. They swung wide, circled the village in a flash, and hit the enemy from an angle they never saw coming. The infantry marching alongside couldn't believe it, the tanks were carving through narrow streets, pivoting their massive turrets, and their engines never stopped rumbling. This wasn't a stop-and-start slugfest. This was a rolling tide that simply refused to lose momentum. It was genuinely disorienting for the French observers. They were used to seeing armor stuck, static, vulnerable, chained by logistics and terrain. But the Americans treated their tanks like cavalry, always charging, always exploiting the gap, never lingering long enough to get tagged. A French officer attached to an American armored division later admitted he just couldn't process how quickly entire columns moved positions. His summary was perfect: they fight with motion, he said, not with weight. France's whole doctrine had been about heavy armor and slow, deliberate engagements. The Americans ripped up that rulebook, proving that speed was the deadliest weapon of all. And the sound carried massive psychological weight, too. Town after town, civilians and resistance fighters swore their spirits lifted the moment they heard that promise rolling in before they even saw the steel. For men who had lived under occupation, the rumble was liberation itself. French soldiers marching with the columns noticed how even the German prisoners reacted with visible unease. To the Wehrmacht, who were trained to fear swarming attacks and relentless pressure, that American engine noise meant one thing: the battle was already slipping away. The French were witnessing something totally strategic. It wasn't just that the tanks were fast, the Americans had built an entire ecosystem to keep them moving forever. Think about it, supply trucks shadowed the columns with uncanny precision, delivering fuel and ammo like clockwork. If a Sherman took a hit and went down, forget waiting days for repairs. Mechanics swarmed the machine like surgeons, fixing it in hours. And if it was a total loss, there was always a fresh tank waiting to replace it. The French realized this revelation went way beyond machinery, it was a blueprint for how modern wars were truly won. For those veterans haunted by 1940, the contrast was a shock to the system. Back then, their tanks stalled out of gas, broke down without spare parts, and sat ducks without air support. Now, in 1944, they were watching a synchronized orchestra: tanks, trucks, artillery, and aircraft all humming along in perfect, relentless tempo. It felt less like a battle and more like an unstoppable force of destiny rolling over the continent. By late summer, the French weren't just impressed, they were utterly inspired. That rumbling of the Sherman engine became the soundtrack of liberation, finally drowning out the miserable echoes of defeat with the booming rhythm of victory. Disbelief evaporated, replaced by a fierce, swelling pride. They knew they were marching alongside something new, a power built not just on steel, but on relentless speed and logistical genius. But the true mind-bender came when the Americans finally said, "All right, climb aboard. You're fighting with us." Imagine the feeling of sitting atop that steel frame, the massive engine surging beneath you, vibrating through your entire body. The French tanks of 1940 had been ponderous, claustrophobic machines, slow, defensive bunkers. The Shermans felt alive. They weren't delicate fortresses waiting to break, they were hardy, flexible war horses eager to chew up the road ahead. French volunteers who joined these armored units carried serious baggage. They remembered the sting of defeat, terrified history would repeat itself. But the Americans? They had a confidence born of sheer abundance. To the French, used to scarcity and tension, the Americans' relaxed, almost routine approach to battle felt surreal. As if fighting a war with endless fuel and tanks transformed the chaos into a simple, predictable job. The training sessions hammered the final nail into the coffin of old French doctrine. They were taught how to use radios, real-time coordination, and how to rely on speed rather than brute force. This was revolutionary. Within days, the soldiers who once dreaded tanks were riding them with newfound confidence, marveling at how responsive the Shermans were. They discovered these machines could pivot instantly, accelerate on rough terrain, and sustain long, hard marches without quitting. They were being reintroduced to armored warfare itself. One French lieutenant later recalled hitting thick, muddy ground during his first joint mission. In 1940, that was the place you abandoned your machine. He confessed he braced himself for the engine to fail, for the inevitable shame and breakdown. Instead, the Sherman plowed forward without the slightest hesitation, its tracks gripping the earth with determined certainty. He realized, with an almost childlike wonder, that he wasn't just riding a machine. He was riding a miracle. The French lieutenant was literally bracing for failure, haunted by those gut-wrenching memories of French tanks abandoned like broken toys along the roads in 1940. He expected the Sherman to cough, stall, and sink into the mud, just like the relics of the old war. But then, something crazy happened. That American beast just grabbed the earth and kept plowing forward without skipping a beat. When it finally crested the hill, fully operational, he felt this incredible, almost childlike punch of pure awe. He later wrote, "It was alive, like it carried us on its shoulders, invincible and unstoppable." The Americans hammered home one essential rule. Keep moving, the U.S. sergeants would bark, and you'll live. Stop moving, and you're a target. This wasn't just tactical advice, it was a complete revolution for these French soldiers who had suffered under outdated doctrines of static defense. They realized their allies treated tanks not as clumsy fortresses, but as modern cavalry, designed to flow across the battlefield in massive, sweeping, relentless maneuvers. That speed? It was utterly intoxicating. For the first time in years, these men felt not like relics of a defeated army, but like riders of a new, unstoppable force. But wait, it wasn't just the machines. The small details were mind-blowing: endless spare parts, fuel convoys that seemed to stretch forever, ammunition that never ran dry. The Americans hadn't just built a tank, they had built an entire ecosystem to support it. The French watched, mouths agape, comparing this efficiency bitterly to 1940, when their armor ran dry or broke down with zero support in sight. Now, if a Sherman took a hit, mechanics swarmed it like highly trained surgeons, often getting it back in the fight within hours. To the French, this seemed less like logistics and more like battlefield sorcery. Crucially, the disbelief was deeply emotional. When a French soldier climbed onto a Sherman, he was symbolically climbing out of the long, dark shadow of 1940. Every kilometer they covered with the Americans was a symbolic journey away from humiliation and toward redemption. They were finally shedding the unbearable weight of defeat. Riding these tanks, they no longer felt like sad spectators to liberation, they felt like its proud authors. By that autumn, French units were fighting on their own, proving they'd absorbed the lessons. Yet, many admitted privately they still struggled to believe what they were seeing. The sight of France advancing behind fast, unstoppable tanks felt almost too miraculous after years of despair. The doubt, however, was silenced by the roar of the engines beneath them. The nightmare of helplessness was ending, and the French were riding into history atop America's armored giants. Disbelief had transformed into something visceral: fury. For these soldiers, the speed of the Shermans was no longer a curiosity, it was a weaponized rage, a living force that carried them into battles where momentum was the deciding factor. They had watched villages liberated so fast that German defenses literally crumbled before they could even reorganize. For the French, who had endured 4 years of national humiliation, this was not just war, it was revenge delivered with steel and fire. Consider the joint operation near Paris. The Germans had dug in, confident that narrow streets and barricades would stall Allied armor, just like they had stalled the French in 1940. Wrong. The Shermans didn't slow down. They surged forward in columns, smashing through weak points and circling defenders with shocking velocity. The German lines flipped almost instantly. These victories were not just tactical, they were acts of redemption. The situation didn't just change, it flipped. They watched as those German strongholds, the ones that should have held out for days, were just bypassed or completely crushed within hours. Suddenly, the invincible Germans looked slow, clumsy, and totally lost. For the French guys, this wasn't just a win, this was hitting the rewind button on history. Every German who ran, every position abandoned, felt like a piece of that crushing 1940 shame just dissolving into the dust. This speed wasn't just tactical, it was a head game. It was the French finally reclaiming a sense of dominance they thought was gone forever. They weren't the victims of the Blitzkrieg anymore. Hell, they were riding one. This whole furious rush of liberation, it peaked when they finally rolled into Paris in August 1944. Sure, the resistance fighters did the bloody work on the ground, but when those free French tanks, decked out in American steel, rumbled down the boulevards. That was the mic drop moment. Civilians were throwing flowers and weeping tears of pure joy, but imagine being one of those soldiers on the tank. That disbelief, we actually made it, they looked back at the relentless journey, the constant engine rumble that had become the soundtrack to freedom. They knew, deep down, without that speed, without that unstoppable momentum, Paris would have stayed locked down far, far longer. On other fronts, that fury got ruthless. Out in Lorraine and Alsace, they were finally facing the real monsters, the German tigers and panthers, machines that could one-shot a Sherman. But here's the twist, the French had learned the ultimate rule, asterisk speed is survival star. They didn't try to slug it out. They drove those Shermans like a pack of starving wolves, circling, flanking, never sitting still, turning the heavy German tanks into isolated targets. What truly blew their minds? It worked, and it kept working. There was always another Sherman. Always more fuel. Always reinforcements ready to roll. France had never fought a war like this, a war of total abundance, where sheer velocity and numbers crushed those fearsome, isolated German giants. For men who had once cowered before German panzers, the transformation was staggering. When they heard engines roaring in the distance now, it wasn't the sound of retreat and terror like in 1940. It was the sound of attack. The ghosts of 1940 were still there, sure. It was hard to process the broken memories against the furious momentum of 44. But now, that doubt was mixed with a fierce pride. They realized their army, reborn in American steel, could actually reclaim its honor. This fury wasn't blind rage, it was focused, disciplined vengeance. Every liberated town, every road retaken, every German unit scattered was proof. America's fast tanks hadn't just changed the battle map, they had fundamentally changed France itself. That initial shock they felt in Normandy. Seeing those endless columns of steel rolling across the fields. That feeling had matured. It wasn't just astonishment anymore, it was deep recognition. They realized this wasn't just a powerful military, it was a brand new way to fight a war. Forget the old school where armored warfare was this heavy, lumbering contest between giants trying to punch through thick armor. This was a dynamic, fast-paced dance, all about mobility, brilliant logistics, and perfect coordination. The French, who had been victims of the original Blitzkrieg, now found themselves utterly absorbed, becoming students of this American creed. The lessons were everywhere. Take Lorraine, French units fighting alongside the Americans weren't wasting time hammering uselessly against entrenched German strong points. Nope. They just drove around them. Bypassed them completely. And the tempo was frankly unbelievable. You'd wake up, and a crucial river crossing that should have taken weeks was bridged almost overnight, just to keep the pace relentless. French officers, still clinging to their old 1940 manuals, the ones that preached slow, methodical advances, must have had their heads spinning. The Americans struck one day in one direction, and the next day they were 50 kilometers away, hitting a completely different target. That kind of fluidity was nothing short of a revelation. Even when the Germans mounted a desperate counterattack during the brutal fighting in the Ardennes that December, the French noticed the crucial difference. The enemy still relied on that sudden, shocking armored thrust, hoping to replicate the paralyzing effect of 1940. But this time, the Allies just absorbed the blow. They didn't collapse. They regrouped, and then, bam, they unleashed their own tanks in counterattacks with astonishing, devastating speed. The French who fought alongside them were stunned by the resilience of the whole system. The French army of 1940 had been shattered by the first hammer blow, now, the Allies rebounded, proving definitively that superior mobility and sheer logistics could withstand even the fiercest German assault. By early 1945, the French weren't just watching the show, they were running it. French armored divisions, fully equipped with the Shermans, advanced through Alsace and deep into Germany itself. The disbelief of 1944, the pure amazement that the tanks could move so fast, be so reliable, and come in such endless numbers, had vanished. In its place was rock-solid conviction. They believed in the system because they had seen it win, and they carried those lessons home. Post-war, the French army totally rebuilt its armored doctrine on those three American pillars: speed, coordination, and the critical importance of supply. But the transformation went so much deeper than tactics. For the men who survived the shame of 1940 and then rode these tanks of liberation, the fast American Shermans became the ultimate symbol of redemption. Riding into liberated towns, they felt the old humiliation burning away, replaced by the white-hot fire of momentum. They realized armor wasn't just the tool of their conquerors, it was the instrument of their freedom. That haunting disbelief turned into fierce pride, and that pride reshaped the French nation. When those officers wrote their reports after the war, and the soldiers told their stories, one word was constantly repeated: speed. They finally understood that a tank wasn't a fortress, it was a weapon of movement, an engine of tempo. The French soldier, once broken by the memory of Blitzkrieg, had learned a new kind of warfare from his allies. America's fast tanks had shown him that victory comes not from holding your ground, but from never stopping, from keeping the thunder rolling until the enemy collapsed for good. What started as shock in 1944 ended up as the foundational doctrine for their future, and in that journey, the French soldier found not just a new way to fight, but a restored sense of national dignity.